Violet Morrison arrived at Heir Court with one valise in her right hand and ink stains at both cuffs, and the footman who opened the carriage door looked first at the case, then at her sleeves, and then over her shoulder as if expecting a proper young lady to appear behind her. No one did. The drive had ended at a sweep of pale gravel before a facade of stone so clean it seemed washed each dawn. The windows stood in rigid rows above her, reflective and cold in the afternoon light, while inside the great doors the entrance hall stretched in a long expanse of marble and polished black rail. Sound thinned there. Even the carriage wheels rolling away seemed to retreat politely, as though noise required permission. A woman in dark grey waited at the threshold with a ring of keys against her hip, and the expression of someone who had already sorted Violet into an administrative category. "Miss Morrison," she said. "Mrs. Hale, housekeeper, your room is prepared in the east wing. You are to report to the blue morning room at once." "At once," Violet repeated. She did not ask whether she might wash the road dust from her face first. She did not ask whether her mother was in residence or passing through. She followed Mrs. Hale over the marble squares, her own boots making the smallest sound in the room, one valise knocking against her knee at each step like a metronome set to consequence. The blue morning room had high windows, 2 writing desks, and a cold fire laid for evening. Lenora Morrison stood at the mantel, gloved though she was indoors, one hand resting on the frame of a portrait that had painted her youth kinder than life had. She did not turn when Violet entered. "Close the door," Lenora said. Violet did. Only then did Lenora look at her. Her eyes were pale and clear and incurious, the eyes of a woman accustomed to bargains and bored by the emotional cost of them. "You refused Mr. Pritchard in front of witnesses," she said. "Your wording was direct enough to be remembered. He asked for obedience in place of regard. He asked for marriage." Violet placed the valise beside the door and straightened. "I gave my answer." Lenora held out her hand. A folded document lay between her fingers. "And I have given mine. As of this morning, your marriage portion is suspended. The sum remains under trust, pending your compliance with family direction." The words were legal, neutral, sharpened by practice. Violet took the paper and read the signature at the bottom. D. Dane, solicitor. Her own name sat in the 3rd line as if she had already agreed. Lenora crossed to the nearer desk and sat. "Mr. Dane has drafted a practical arrangement. Your brother's apprenticeship fees are due at quarter's end. Those payments will continue only while you serve this estate in useful capacity and provide weekly reporting. Heir receives correspondence from French and Italian tenants, merchants and factors. You have languages. You will translate." Violet looked down at the page again. There, in tight script, term of summer appointment, stipend disbursed to Morrison account, deductions permitted for losses incurred under supervision. She had copied enough contracts to know where the barbs were hidden. "You would cancel Elias's place in the yard over this." Lenora's gaze did not flicker. "Do not dramatize finance. It is unbecoming." The room smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender water. Outside, a gardener called for twine and was answered from somewhere below the window. Ordinary sounds, work sounds. Violet kept her hand still on the page so Lenora would not see the tremor in her fingers. "You have always mistaken stubbornness for character," Lenora said. "This is not London. There are no sympathetic onlookers here. At Heir you will be measured by utility, and utility can be taught." Violet lifted her eyes. "If I sign, Elias remains in his apprenticeship." "If you sign and perform, yes. If I do not," Lenora folded her gloves against her palm, "then your brother returns home. He may seek employment where he can." Violet knew what that meant. It meant dock labour, bad air, wages that vanished between Saturday and Monday, a gifted boy bent down by necessity before he had reached 19. Elias had written last month of brass fittings he had learned to turn so clean they caught light, like coin. He had enclosed a sketch in the margin, proud and careful. Violet saw that page now with painful clarity. She reached for the pen. Lenora watched the movement with detached satisfaction, as if a misplaced item had at last been returned to shelf. "One further point," she said. "Mr. Pritchard remains amenable. You will not complicate that prospect with public remarks or dramatic refusals." Violet set pen to line. "I have no intention of drama. See that you have no intention of pride either." Ink spread beneath the nib in a thin, dark curve as she signed. Her name looked unchanged. She felt changed in the wrist that had written it. A knock came. Mr. Dane entered without waiting, carrying a leather folio and wearing an expression built to avoid moral weather. He bowed to Lenora first, then to Violet. "Miss Morrison, if you would initial the wage schedule." Violet did. "Excellent," he said, gathering pages while she was still drying the signature with blotting sand. "For clarity, your weekly report is to be addressed to chambers in London. Any household irregularities pertaining to expenditure are to be noted." Lenora stood. "You begin tonight. The household dines at 8. You will attend. Speak when spoken to." Violet rose as well. "Yes, Mother." Lenora moved toward the door, then paused. "Keep your voice low, Violet. Loud women are remembered for the wrong reasons." When the door closed, Mr. Dane cleared his throat and tucked the contract into his folio. "My clerk will provide duplicate copies," he said. "Good afternoon." She was alone in the blue room with a dead fire and her valise by the door. So this was the shape of it. Refusal in London had not bought freedom. It had bought terms. Her own life narrowed to preserve someone else's beginning. By the second morning, Hallowik had taught her its discipline. A bell at 6 for servants' breakfast, another at 8 for household accounts, one sharp peal at noon for posting riders, another at 4 for tea and inventory corrections. Names, sums, grain weights, roof invoices, tenant petitions copied into orderly books. Violet translated letters from Marseille, from Livorno, from Lyon, each carrying freight numbers and complaints about delayed payment, and delivered them in neat stacks to the steward's office, where Mr. Hollis thanked her without seeing her face. She learned where she was allowed. Her room in the east wing had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small desk set under a window that looked toward the kitchen gardens rather than the lawns. A courtesy room, not a daughter's room. At dinner she sat midway down the table, close enough for instruction, far enough for disregard. Conversation moved around estates and invitations and horseflesh while she passed dishes, answered when addressed, and kept count of the moments in which her name appeared only to designate a task. On the third evening, Footman Carter ignored the still-room request for tea because the main drawing room required fresh cups. Violet saw the note left, folded near the service bell, saw the old cook's apprentice glance toward it, and then away, and took up the tray herself. The silver pot was heavier than it looked, heat pressing through cloth to her palms. She carried it along the back corridor where plaster gave way to brick and perfume, gave way to yeast, herbs, damp stone. In the still room, Mrs. Beale looked up from dried chamomile and blinked. "Miss Morrison, you should not—" "The tea would go cold otherwise," Violet said, setting the tray down. "And I need the lavender tally for tomorrow's ledger if you have it." Mrs. Beale handed over the paper with both hands, as though accepting and returning a confidence. "You are kind." Violet folded the tally into her sleeve. "No, merely punctual." Yet, as she walked back through the servants' passage, she felt something settle into place that was not resignation. If she was to be valued for usefulness, she would choose the terms of usefulness where she could. The fourth day brought rain and a stack of dictated letters from Lenora, now in London, each sealed with her crest and each requiring immediate response. Mr. Dane's second note arrived at noon. Confirm compliance, include comments on household economies, forward by Friday coach. Violet copied the necessary figures, omitted the pettier observations, and listed only what affected wages, repairs, and tenant stores. She understood what was requested. She refused the smaller cruelties without declaring refusal. At supper, Mrs. Lennox from the neighbouring estate spoke across Violet as if she were furniture polished weekly. Such a comfort, Lenora, to have a daughter useful with languages. Mine has only pianoforte and opinions. Lenora smiled into her wine. Usefulness can be cultivated if one begins early. Violet buttered a roll for Mrs. Lennox, passed it across, and said nothing. Later, in the corridor outside the dining room, she heard two maids speaking while they folded linen. Is she companion or family? Neither, I think. She works. The words were not malicious. They were practical. Heir sorted people by function, and she had been given hers in writing. That night she opened her valise at last. Inside lay 3 dresses fit for labour rather than display, 2 grammar books with loose bindings, Elias's last letter, and a coin purse already light. She placed the letter in the desk drawer, counted coins by candlelight, and calculated how much must remain untouched if she meant to send a private remittance to her brother in case Lenora delayed the official payment to remind them both who held the reins. When the house settled and the final bell sounded, Violet sat at the small desk and wrote to Elias in a careful hand. Your place is secure for now. Work hard. Keep your lungs covered in the mornings. If, Mr. Trent offers extra hours, take them only if the air in the lower shop is clear. She stopped there, pen hovering. She did not mention Mr. Pritchard. She did not mention contracts or terms or voices kept low. She wrote instead of Heir's orchards and the precision of estate clocks and the absurd number of ledgers one house could produce in a week, because humour, even dry and thin, was kinder than alarm. On the 5th evening, when the dinner bell rang and no one moved to carry tea to the still room, Violet lifted the tray herself and walked toward the servants' staircase, one hand steady beneath the silver weight, as though steadiness were a language no contract could seize. She shifted the tray to her left palm before the first stair turned, steadied the pot with her right, and descended into the warmer air below stairs where onions, soap, and damp stone mixed into the true breath of Heir Court. In the still room, Mrs. Beale had already set out chipped cups beside bundles of mint and lemon balm, and 2 kitchen maids stood back as Violet entered, eyes lowered less from deference than confusion at seeing her there again. You are prompt, Mrs. Beale said. Then, quieter, you are not required. No one is required until someone is thirsty, Violet answered, setting the tray down and lifting the lid so steam could rise. How many jars of dried lavender were moved this afternoon? The account from yesterday did not match the shelf. Mrs. Beale gave the number at once. Violet repeated it, wrote it in the margin of her folded tally, and accepted the still-room ledger with a nod. She did not linger. She poured 4 cups, left 2 by the mortar table, and carried the empty tray back through the passage while the kitchen clocks struck the quarter. Upstairs, the corridors were already dimmed for evening, lamps turned low to preserve candles, portraits watching with varnished calm as she passed. She entered the east wing room assigned to her, set the tray by the door, and copied lavender quantities, soap costs and lamp oil usage into the household book before changing for dinner. Her second-best gown smelled faintly of starch and ink. It would have to do. At table, Mr. Hollis spoke to Lenora's empty chair, as if her absence were another form of presence. Lady Morrison requests stricter notation of wastage in dairy and game, he said, passing a dish to no one in particular. Miss Morrison, you will append remarks for tomorrow's dispatch. I will append figures, Violet said. He glanced up. And remarks. Figures will be accurate. That was all she offered. Across from her, Mrs. Lennox's nephew smiled into his wine as if accuracy were a quaint form of rebellion. Violet turned to her plate and ate exactly enough to remain upright through the evening entries. When dinner ended, she returned to the blue morning room, where 2 candles had been left burning beside Lenora's correspondence packet. The first letter was short and written in the controlled hand Violet had learned to read before she had learned to read tenderness. You are to remember that your position at Heirwick is contingent. Do not cultivate familiarity with staff. Do not omit details from Mr. Dane's requested notices. Keep your voice low. The phrase arrived each time like a bell struck against bone. Violet folded the letter once, then twice, and placed it beneath her ledger. She wrote the report to Mr. Dane in steady script. Grain deliveries received, roof tiles delayed from Rochester, orchard labour reduced by 1 due to fever, lamp oil corrected after duplicate billing. She listed numbers. She omitted gossip. Where his prior note had asked for irregular temper among servants, she wrote, no irregularity affecting estate function observed. Near midnight she sealed the pages, sanded the wet ink, and walked them to the dispatch box herself. Carter, the footman, stood by the side hall door and took the packet with a look that mixed pity and incomprehension. You keep late hours, miss. So does the postcoach, Violet said. In her room, she opened Elias's letter again before sleeping, tracing his careful drawing of a brass coupling with 1 finger until the candle stung her eyes. I am not tired, she told herself, and then laughed under her breath at the futility of that private lie. She slept lightly and woke before the 6 o'clock bell, as if Heirwick had wound a spring in her chest. By the end of her first week, her days ran on grooves so narrow she could feel each turn before it arrived. Morning translation in the steward's office with doors half open and no fire lit. Noon inventories carried to stores where clerks checked her arithmetic twice and thanked her once. Afternoon dictation of letters Lenora sent from London, as if distance sharpened command. Evening compilation of wages and repairs. And at last the private postscript to Elias that she wrote on scraps too small for official use. She moved through marble and service brick, through drawing-room perfume and root-cellar damp, through every rank of the house without belonging wholly to any of them. If she paused in a corridor, someone handed her paper. If she entered a room, someone asked for totals. In the servants' hall, she was Miss Morrison, said with caution. In the formal rooms, she was our translator, said without looking. Society had a label for women like her. Useful. The label was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. On Saturday, rain pinned the household indoors and doubled her workload. Merchant letters arrived blotched from travel. One from Livorno written in a hand so ornamental she had to hold it to window light to separate flourish from meaning. A dispute over cask measurements in French took an hour to untangle and another to copy. When she carried the corrected version to Mr. Hollis, he read 3 lines and said, "Adequate," as if generosity had cost him effort. At noon, Mrs. Hale stopped her outside the linen room. "You have not rung for maid service this week." "There has been no need." Mrs. Hale's expression shifted by a degree. Need is not always the point. Violet understood. Needs made visible created a kind of claim. Claims could become protections. She had been taught the opposite too thoroughly to unlearn it in a week. "Then I shall try to need more, elegantly," she said. "Mrs." Hale almost smiled. "Try to eat more first." That evening, while entering wages by lamplight, Violet discovered an error in the apprentice remittance line connected to Elias's account. Not cancelled, but delayed 2 days beyond the promised date. A technicality with sharp edges. She copied the line, marked the discrepancy, and enclosed a direct note to Mr. Dane requesting confirmation of transfer by Monday noon. Her hand remained steady. Her jaw did not. Sunday brought chapel, where she sat 2 pews behind visiting relations and translated a whispered French prayer for an elderly tenant widow who had forgotten half her English after a winter fever. The woman pressed Violet's fingers after the service and said, "You made room for me." Violet bowed, said nothing, and gave her arm on the church steps while others passed without seeing either of them. When they returned to Hallowick, the rain had broken and sunlight lay across the south lawns in clean stripes between clouds. Mrs. Hale intercepted Violet at the side entrance with a stack of household receipts and a request from the steward for immediate orchard figures before supper. Violet took the papers, tucked them beneath her arm, and turned toward the south garden path because it cut 10 minutes from the route to the potting sheds. The path narrowed near the old fountain, where clipped yews gave way to kitchen rose and espaliered pear trees. Voices carried ahead, male and amused in the particular rhythm that sought an audience. "Say it again," one footman called. "Slowly this time." A second laughed. "He can dig but cannot ask for a shovel. Useful creature." Violet rounded the hedge and saw 3 men near the lower irrigation channel. 2 were Hallowick footmen off formal duty, coats discarded, sleeves rolled. The third knelt in wet soil beside a split pipe, one hand bracing the iron joint while water fanned across his trousers and pooled around his boots. He looked up at the laughter with a face composed almost to stillness. "Miss Morrison," said the taller footman, straightening when he noticed her. "We are teaching the new man proper words. He has none." The kneeling man rose in one motion, tall and lean, mud at his cuffs, dark hair damp at the temples. His eyes were grey, not pale, not soft, grey like river slate under clear water, watchful and withheld. A leather tool roll lay open at his feet, each piece aligned too neatly for haste. "What is your name?" Violet asked him. He answered with a slight bow of the head. "Luca Moretti, signorina." The vowels placed him south of Florence, perhaps farther. His accent on her title was careful, almost old-fashioned. The shorter footman grinned. "He says that and little else. Mr. Hollis took him on yesterday from the agency cart, grounds work only." Water still hissed from the split seam, wasting itself into the gravel. Violet handed the orchard receipts to the taller footman without taking her eyes off the man by the pipe. "Hold those." He obeyed before realizing he had. She stepped closer to the channel and spoke in Italian, clear and unhurried. "You need linen and pitch. The joint can be wrapped if the pressure is reduced at the upper valve." For the first time, Luca's expression shifted. His gaze sharpened, a small, precise change that altered the whole face. Intelligence lit there, unmistakable and immediate, followed at once by caution. He replied in the same language, clipped but fluent enough to be no accident. "The valve is stiff. I can force it." "Do not force iron older than you," Violet said. "It will crack." One footman laughed uneasily. "Miss, if he can chatter with you, perhaps he can explain why he took an hour on one pipe." Luca turned his head toward the voice and answered in halting English, thickened now, words deliberately broken. "I work. Pipe bad." The performance was almost convincing. Almost. Violet had heard his Italian consonants strike clean as cut glass. This roughness in English was not incapacity, but choice. She addressed the footman without raising her voice. "Fetch linen strips from the potting bench and pitch from the shed. Now." Mr. Hollis did not say to. I am saying to. She held his gaze until he looked away. Unless you prefer to explain water loss to the steward yourself. They moved, muttering, one to each errand. When they were out of earshot, Violet crouched at the channel edge, keeping her skirts clear of the mud by habit, born of necessity. You understand more than you claim, she said in Italian, low enough for privacy. Luca kept one hand on the valve wheel. Enough for work. Only for work? His mouth almost curved, not quite a smile. Words are tools. I choose which to carry. A less careful woman might have pressed him then. Violet did not. She had lived too long among people who weaponized information to squander the difference between knowing and proving. She held out her hand. Give me the wrench. He passed it to her without hesitation. Together they eased the upper valve shut by degrees, his hand over hers for one brief turn where the metal stuck. His palm was calloused, yes, but the pressure he used was precise, calibrated, like someone taught to handle delicate instruments rather than brute force. When the flow reduced to a trickle, she stepped back and returned the wrench. The footman came running with linen and pitch. Violet took both, handed them to Luca, and rose. Mr. Hollis will require repair notation, she said in English for all to hear. You will submit it by evening. Luca lowered his eyes in the deferential manner expected of hired labour. Yes, miss. Submit. She took back the orchard receipts from the taller footman, now damp at one corner where his hand had sweated through the paper. You may return to your assigned duties, she told them. They went. Not quickly, but they went. For a moment, only the clipped sound of linen wrapping pipe filled the space between the pear trees. Violet turned to leave, then paused. Signor Moretti, she said over her shoulder in Italian, if they mock your silence, let them. Silence is often the better bargain. When she looked back, he had lifted his head. The grey eyes met hers directly this time, and in them she saw recognition without gratitude, respect without deference. It unsettled her more than flattery would have. As you wish, signorina, he replied, and the words were formal enough to close the exchange. Violet walked on toward the steward's office with wet earth scent clinging to her hem and the orchard figures cooling under her fingers, aware that a hinge had turned somewhere inside the ordered machinery of Heir, though no bell rang to announce it. She kept walking until the yews gave way to stone again, then mounted the side steps and entered by the steward's corridor, where ink, dust and boiled wool displaced the scent of wet soil. Mr. Hollis stood at the high desk with 2 ledgers open and a clerk waiting beside him with fresh quills. He looked up as Violet laid down the orchard receipts. You are 12 minutes late, Miss Morrison. The south irrigation joint split, she said. Water pressure has been reduced and the repair is underway. You will have full notation by evening. His brows tightened. Who authorized interruption to orchard counting? I did. A pause. The clerk kept his eyes on the quills. Mr. Hollis tapped the page with one finger. Groundsmen are not to be redirected by office staff. Water loss concerns office figures. I made a practical correction. He studied her face as if deciding whether to reprimand her for tone, then chose the safer field of paper. Very well. Enter the variance under maintenance and include labour hours. Lady Morrison requires precision. Lady Morrison receives precision, Violet answered and moved to the side table before he could turn precision into praise for obedience. By the time she returned to her room, the light had thinned to pewter at the window. Her hem had dried in a dark, uneven line, and mud had flecked one cuff despite her care. She changed quickly, copied the irrigation variance into the maintenance ledger, and carried 3 account books to dinner. because Mr. Hollis had requested post-meal corrections. At table, no one asked why her sleeve had been splashed. Mrs. Lennox discussed pianists. Her nephew discussed horse bloodlines. A visiting cousin of Lenora's asked whether foreign labour was truly reliable, and Mr. Hollis answered without glancing toward Violet. Reliable when supervised. After the final course, Mrs. Hale placed a sealed London letter beside Violet's plate. The wax bore Lenora's crest. Violet waited until she reached the blue morning room before breaking it. You will remember that gratitude is expected from dependents and silence is expected from daughters. Keep your reports factual. Keep your voice low. The phrasing was almost identical to the previous week, only narrower. Violet folded the sheet and set it under the newest wage register. Her hand trembled once when she reached for the pen, then steadied as numbers resumed their old authority. £47 to roof slate, £9 3 shillings to lamp oil, 2 shillings deducted for cracked dairy jars. She copied until the candle burned low enough to gutter. When she left the room, she carried the corrected books against her chest and took the courtyard cut to save steps before locking them in the steward's office for morning. Rain had started while she worked. Not hard, but persistent enough to turn flagstones dark and slick. She crossed half the square before she saw him near the broken fountain at the far wall. Sleeves rolled, one hand braced on the rim as he examined a warped stone spout. Luca Moretti straightened when he noticed her. In rain and lamplight, his work coat looked nearly black, his hair damp at the temples again, his expression unreadable. Violet did not stop. Then a drop struck the top ledger and spread into a blurred oval over fresh ink. She halted under the open sky with annoyance rising sharp in her throat. He closed the distance in 4 strides and held out a folded linen cloth, dry beneath his coat. "Peri libri," he said. "For the books." She looked at the cloth, then at him. "You expected rain?" He tilted his head in a gesture almost like apology. "I expected Hallowig stone. It holds water where it should not." A lesser answer would have been deference. This was observation. Violet accepted the cloth and pressed it lightly to the page before the blot deepened. "Thank you," she said in Italian. "You keep spare linen for ledgers now?" "For tools," he replied. "Tonight, they are the same thing." The line should have sounded flippant. In his mouth, it sounded exact. She wiped the second mark, then handed the cloth back. He did not take it. "Keep it," he said, still in Italian. "Gaze on the books rather than her face. The sky will not finish quickly." Rain ticked against the fountain basin. Somewhere beyond the kitchen wing, a door closed, then opened again. Violet shifted the ledgers under her arm and found no proper response ready, only the practical one. "The maintenance note for the South Channel is due before first bell." "It is already in the steward's box," she frowned. "He asked for it at supper." "I wrote it before supper." In English, he stumbled over verbs and pretended to hunt for nouns. In Italian, every syllable landed where intended. Violet felt that contradictions settle beside the others she had begun to collect, without admitting she collected them. "You are efficient, Signor Moretti." His mouth moved then, not fully, but enough to alter his face from severe to unexpectedly young. "So are you, Miss Morrison." She should have left at once. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Did they trouble you after this afternoon?" Men who need witnesses to laugh are rarely dangerous. He glanced toward the wing where servant windows glowed faintly. "Only loud." That answer, too, refused the script she expected. Not wounded complaint, not false bravado. A measured classification, as if he sorted people like mechanical parts and trusted only accurate labels. Violet adjusted the ledgers against her shoulder. "Good night, then." "Buonanotte," he said, and stepped back to let her pass, one hand resting on the fountain stone as though he had been there for hours and would remain for hours more. She reached the steward's door, locked the books inside, and returned through the long corridor to the east wing with rain whispering at the panes. Nothing had occurred that could be named. A cloth, 2 sentences. A smile so brief it might have been lamplight. Yet, as she undid her cuffs in the dim room, she was aware of a small warmth under her ribs that did not belong to victory or relief. 3 days later, the warmth had not vanished, though she refused to test it by thought. Work kept the safer cadence. At morning table, Mrs. Hale handed her orchard tallies and a note from Mr. Hollis requiring immediate reconciliation with labour hours in the upper terraces. Violet took both, gathered her pencils and walked to the west outbuildings where the gardeners kept seasonal books on a shelf above seed crates. By the second week of June, Halewick had entered the phase where growth outpaced record-keeping unless someone chased both from dawn to dusk. She found Luca at the far terrace measuring replacement planks for a trellis ladder. 2 boys from the stable held one end while he scored marks with a carpenter's knife. He looked up once as she approached, then returned to the cut line and spoke to the boys in slow, broken English that would have sounded patient if she had not heard the deliberate roughness before. "Hold straight, no move." The older boy rolled his eyes when Luca turned away. Violet pretended not to see and opened her ledger on an overturned crate. "Mr. Hollis wants labour hour totals against pear yields," she said in English, "for the boys' benefit. Can you give me the terrace figures?" Luca blinked as if translating. "Figures. Yes, wait." He wiped his hands and came to the crate. When he leaned over the page, rain-dark lashes casting a thin shadow on his cheek, she caught the clean scent of cedar soap under earth and iron. He read the columns swiftly, tapped 2 entries, and spoke in halting English again. "Here. Wrong. This day 2 men sick, not 4 working. 2. She checked the prior page. He was right. The copied count had doubled the absent pair by carrying the previous line forward. A small clerical error, easy to miss, costly over a month. "You noticed from memory?" she asked in Italian, low. He answered in the same language without looking up. "From pattern. Your columns are usually symmetrical." Violet stared at him for a beat too long. Few people at Halewick saw her pages as anything but obligation. Fewer still noticed the shape of her methods. "You read my hand often, then?" "When numbers decide wages, I read carefully." The older stable boy coughed, impatient. Luca straightened and returned to clumsy English. "I go cut wood now." She closed the ledger. "Thank you, Signor Moretti." He gave the slightest nod and resumed the trellis work. She carried the corrected figures back to the steward's office and said only, "Upper terrace entry amended for illness variance." Mr. Hollis grunted and signed the margin without asking who had found the error. A week later, tenant petitions crowded her desk in the blue morning room because 2 neighbouring holdings disputed drainage rights along the lower lane. The letters arrived in French from one side, legal English from the other, and an angry bilingual note from a miller who had lost 2 days' use of his wheel. Mr. Hollis wanted summaries before luncheon. Violet translated until her wrist ached, then took the bundle to the records alcove adjoining the old library to retrieve past agreements. The alcove ladder stuck at the 3rd rung. She braced one foot, reached for the shelf, and felt the wood shift under her weight. Before she could step down, a hand steadied the ladder rail from below. She looked down. Luca stood there in work clothes, jaw set, eyes on the warped rung rather than her ankle. "Do not use this side," he said in English, accent thick again for anyone passing the corridor. "Bad wood." She descended carefully. No one else was near. He released the ladder and switched to Italian, voice quiet. There is a brace missing. It should have been repaired in spring. How do you know what should have been repaired in spring? He paused, half a breath. Because I inspected these rooms in spring. As groundsman? A fraction of a smile. As a man who dislikes collapse. She should have challenged him. Instead, she handed him the top petition from her stack. Read this line. The French term for embankment here is ambiguous. He took the paper with hands still marked by fresh splinters and read silently. When he spoke, his translation was precise, legal rather than colloquial. Not embankment, retaining wall, different liability. Violet looked from the word to his face. Where did you learn legal French? He returned the page. From people who charged too much for it. Footsteps approached at the far corridor. Lucas shifted at once, expression blanking into labourer reserve. In broken English, louder now, he said, You need other book? Yes, she answered in matching formality. The 1819 drainage register. He fetched it from the lower shelf without using the ladder, and placed it in her hands with a deferential bow that would have convinced anyone who had not seen his eyes 2 seconds earlier. When she delivered the petition summaries, Mr. Hollis skimmed them and paused at her correction in the margin. Retaining wall? Are you certain? I am. He grunted assent. Then we avoid a hearing. Send notices this afternoon. She sent them. By evening, a rider carried both translations to the lane tenants, and the miller's wheel resumed the next morning. Late in June, Chapel Roof estimates arrived from Canterbury with inflated transport charges, and Mr. Hollis cursed over them in the accounts room while 2 clerks pretended to be shocked by arithmetic. Violet stood at the side desk with the freight ledger open. Luca entered to deliver slate samples from the yard, cap in hand, head lowered in the same posture he used before authority. Mr. Hollis dismissed him with irritation. Leave those there, we do not require commentary. Luca set the slate on the table and turned to go. Violet's eye caught a mismatch in the freight entries. One line listed carriage distance from a depot that did not exist on the Kent route. Before she could frame the objection, Luca's gaze moved once over the page as he passed, and he paused near the door. In broken English to the room, he said, Road from East Marsh, closed last winter, no carts there. Mr. Hollis snapped, Since when does a gardener audit invoices? Luca bowed slightly. Since wheels sink in marsh, sir. The first clerk hid a smile behind his hand. Mr. Hollis glared at all 3 of them, then stabbed the ledger with his finger. Miss Morrison, verify route. She did, quickly, against the county map pinned near the fire. The depot address was false. Charges were padded by nearly 1/3. Signor Moretti is correct, she said. Mr. Hollis looked as though he had swallowed vinegar. Send a refusal and demand revised quote. She wrote the refusal before luncheon. The corrected estimate arrived 2 days later, reduced exactly by the inflated sum. The pattern had become too consistent to ignore and too delicate to confront. Luca knew supply routes, legal phrasing, structural schedules, and the internal habits of a house he had supposedly entered a week before she met him. He carried himself like a man trained to be obeyed and spent his days pretending not to understand instructions unless they concerned labour. He spoke English as though each sentence were an unwanted debt, yet, when no witness stood near, his Italian carried no hesitation at all. By the first week of July, Violet had stopped telling herself these were isolated anomalies. They were a design. She simply did not know its purpose. That evening she crossed the lower courtyard with a stack of corrected shipping letters tied in blue ribbon, heading for the dispatch chest before the London coach bell. Near the archway, Luca was repairing a cracked wheelbarrow handle by lamplight, sleeves turned, movements economical. He glanced up as she passed. Late again, he said in Italian. So are you. He tightened the binding wire and tested the joint with one hand. Some things break daily. She held his gaze. Some things are made to look broken. For the first time since the fountain, silence stretched between them, not as caution, but as acknowledgement. He set the tool down, wiped his palm on a rag, and said in careful, unaccented Italian, "You notice too much, Miss Morrison. Only what affects the ledger." His mouth curved, that brief, transforming, almost smile that vanished as quickly as it came. "Then keep very accurate ledgers." She inclined her head once and continued toward the coach door, blue ribbon cool against her fingers, her pulse steady and quick at once. Behind her, the sound of his hammer resumed, regular as a clock, while Hallowick's evening bell rang the hour over stone, gardens, and the quiet machinery of a summer that had begun to conceal more than it revealed. The hammering followed her to the dispatch door, each strike measured, each pause exact, as if Luca Moretti were mending wood and marking time together. Carter took the ribboned letters, checked the wax, and slid them into the coach chest without comment. When Violet turned back into the courtyard, lamplight had gathered in shallow pools across the stone, and the house had entered that hour between labour and sleep, when no one admitted how much work remained. She crossed toward the east passage and saw Mrs. Hale waiting in the arch, keys quiet against her skirt. "Mr. Hollis asks for tool inventory at first bell," the housekeeper said. "He wants signatures from both steward's office and grounds." "Then I shall be in the shed at 6. Mrs. Hale studied her face for a moment, as if she saw the fatigue and chose not to name it. "Eat something before you sleep." Violet inclined her head and went on. By dawn, the air smelled of wet rope and turned earth. She entered the gardener's shed with a slate board, 2 sharpened pencils, and yesterday's maintenance list. Luca stood at the far bench sorting pruning hooks by size, while 2 younger hands stacked twine and seed trays. He looked up once when she came in, gave her the labourer's brief nod he used in company, and returned to the hooks. Violet set the slate on a barrel and began reading each item aloud in English, so everyone could answer and no one could claim secrecy. 3 long-handled shears, 6 grafting knives, 2 silver-marked pruning sets for orchard demonstrations, 1 locking case for the silver. The older of the boys fetched the locking case from the shelf and set it down. The lid stood open. Inside, velvet slots waited empty. Violet went still. "Where are the silver sets?" she asked. The boy swallowed. "They were here yesterday, miss. Mr. Pike asked for them after dinner." At the name, the head gardener, Pike, appeared at the door with mud on his boots and impatience already arranged on his face. "Do not look at me. I signed them back last evening." "You signed them to whom?" Violet asked. "To Moretti. Who else had the key?" Luca set down the hook in his hand. "No key," he said in halting English. "I not take." Pike gave a short, contemptuous breath. "Convenient memory." Before Violet could answer, Mr. Hollis strode in behind him, coat buttoned to the throat despite the heat of the shed, ledger tucked under one arm. His gaze moved from the empty case to Luca, and satisfaction hardened his mouth before he spoke. "Missing silver is not a puzzle," he said. "It is theft. Moretti, collect your pay and leave by noon." The youngest boy made a small sound and looked at the floor. Pike looked relieved. Luca did not move. "I not steal," he said, each word shaped as if dragged through gravel. "Mr." Hollis snapped the ledger open. "You are under no burden to confess. You are under instruction to depart." Violet heard her own voice before she had planned it. "On what proof?" Mr. Hollis turned to her with visible irritation. "On inventory signed and inventory absent." "Then the fault may be process, not person." The fault sits in front of us. Luca's eyes shifted toward her, grey and unreadable. She felt the whole shed listening. Dismissal without reference over disputed tools will prevent him from finding work, she said. Mr. Hollis gave a dry laugh. Miss Morrison, estate discipline is not a language exercise. You will record the loss and stop obstructing. He began writing the dismissal notation in the margin of his book. Violet watched the nib scratch across paper and saw, as clearly as if it were written in her own hand, the next line. Wages withheld pending restitution. No wages meant no fare. No fare meant a man put on the road with a ruined name. She also saw Elias's remittance line waiting in her own ledger upstairs, already narrow. Enter the value, she said. Mr. Hollis looked up. What? Enter the value of the missing sets. He named the sum. It was worse than she expected. She took a breath, then another. Deduct it from my wages. No one spoke. Even Pike stared at her. Mr. Hollis blinked as if he had misheard. Your wages are contracted to household translation, not grounds losses. Then amend the contract schedule. I authorize voluntary deduction against this quarter. His expression sharpened. For a man you do not know. For a process I do know, she answered. If the tools are not recovered, you are reimbursed. If they are recovered, the amount is restored. He closed the ledger halfway. You cannot absorb that sum and maintain your own obligations. I have seen the remittance notations. She met his eyes. Record the deduction. It was not mercy that moved him. It was arithmetic and convenience. Arguing with her would waste the morning, and the estate would be made whole on paper by noon. He signalled to his clerk, who had hovered by the door, and dictated the entry in clipped terms. Voluntary wage deduction, immediate effect, signed by Miss Violet Morrison, witnessed by steward. The clerk produced a loose form. Violet took the pen, signed once, then again where witness required. Ink dried dark across her name. Mr. Hollis turned the book toward Luca without looking at him. You remain provisionally employed. Any further discrepancy and you are gone. Luca gave the smallest bow. Yes, sir. Hollis shut the ledger with a flat sound. Miss Morrison, send a copy to Mr. Dane by the noon rider. I will. When the men filed out, Pike muttering, the two boys silent, Violet gathered her papers with hands that stayed steady only because she forced each finger to obey. She could feel her stomach drawing tight in a hard knot under the stays of her dress. She did not look at Luca until the door closed behind the last witness. He had not moved from the bench. You should not have done that, he said in Italian, the rough English gone at once. She stacked the forms in order. Perhaps it is done. You needed that money. So did you. He watched her for a long moment. The grey eyes were sharp, and beneath the sharpness was something she could not classify. Not gratitude, not pride, something heavier. I would have managed, he said. On a black mark from Haylerwick? No. She tied the pages with twine. Do not ask me to pretend otherwise. His jaw shifted once. I did not ask. No, you never ask. She lifted the bundle and turned for the door. His voice stopped her before she crossed the threshold. Miss Morrison, she looked back. I saw what it cost. The words were quiet, unadorned. She inclined her head and left before the steadiness in her face could fail. By that afternoon, the deduction sat in 3 places. In Mr. Hollis's ledger, in the clerk's duplicate, and in the copy she sealed for Mr. Dane. She wrote an accompanying line in formal hand, requesting confirmation that Elias's apprenticeship transfer would proceed on date, despite altered balance. Then she walked the packet to the rider herself and watched him tuck it into the leather postcase. Near dawn the next morning, before first bell, Mrs. Beale sent a kitchen maid to fetch Violet to the service yard. A crate sat outside the gardener's shed. Clean pine, iron-banded, no sender named. Pike pried it open while Hollis watched with suspicion, and 2 grooms leaned in for gossip. Inside lay 2 silver-marked pruning sets wrapped in oiled cloth, newer than the missing pair, and a narrow envelope addressed to Steward, Heir Court. Hollis broke the seal and read in silence, then folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "What does it say?" Pike demanded. "Replacement delivered against prior procurement error," Hollis said. "No action required." Pike frowned. "From whom?" "No action," Hollis repeated. His eyes flicked once toward Violet, then away. He turned to the clerk. "Adjust the loss entry to recovered by anonymous restitution." Violet felt the ground hold steady under her feet by effort alone. Recovered meant her deduction could be restored. Anonymous meant someone with money, access, and a reason had moved quietly in the dark to set the ledger right. When she looked toward the shed door, Luca was there carrying a coil of hose over one shoulder, face composed, as if silver tools appeared from nowhere every Thursday at dawn. He did not meet her eyes in front of the others. He simply walked past, set the hose by the bench, and began his work. 3 days passed before the reply returned from London. "Mr. Dane's note was courteous, brief, and bloodless. Remittance would proceed if no further voluntary deductions impaired projected sum. If further deductions occurred, continuation could not be guaranteed." Violet folded the letter and placed it beneath Elias's last sketch in her desk drawer. Her stomach knotted again when she did the weekly tally. She ate half her supper and could not finish the broth. That evening, the house prepared for the midsummer musicale. Extra lamps were raised in the ballroom, fresh beeswax polished into the banisters, and visiting carriages sent gravel whispering up the drive until sunset. Lenora Morrison had returned from London at noon and taken command of every arrangement by standing in the centre of the blue morning room and issuing short declarative instructions that left no room for weather, fatigue, or dissent. "Place Lady Ainsworth beside the pianoforte. Do not seat the Cartwright sisters together. Miss Morrison will remain available for correspondence and retrieval." Violet answered each command with the same even tone and carried lists, place cards, and revised guest notes between rooms, while musicians tuned strings in the gallery above. At dressing hour, she put on her plainest evening gown, the one least likely to draw comment, and pinned her hair without ornament. Her palm still bore faint crescent marks from where her own nails had pressed earlier in the week while she recalculated Elias's funds. In the ballroom, chandeliers turned every movement bright and merciless. Women in silk spoke behind fans. Men in dark coats assessed rank with glances so practiced they looked like courtesy. Violet stood near the side doors with a ledger of announced guests and answered when addressed. Twice she translated brief French pleasantries for Lenora's acquaintances. Once she carried a tray to an older violinist whose hands shook too hard to hold his own cup. No one thanked her. No one needed to. Near the second set, Lenora touched her sleeve without looking at her. "My ivory fan is in the library. Fetch it." "Yes, mother." The corridor beyond the ballroom felt almost cool after the press of music and perfume. Violet moved quickly past the portrait gallery and reached the library door, half closed against the noise. She raised her hand to knock, then stopped. Lenora's voice came through the gap, flat and bored, speaking to a man Violet knew before he answered. "Affection is irrelevant," Lenora said. "Violet is collateral, and by Michaelmas she will marry where I direct." "Mister," Pritchard gave a soft laugh. "You ask for speed." I ask for compliance. You will have legal assurances. Her preferences are of no consequence. His reply was lower, smug with certainty. She will resist again. She will not. I have corrected the variables. Violet did not move. Her thumbnail pressed into the center of her palm until pain flared white and clean. She watched the grain of the library door sharpen, blur, sharpen again, as if her eyes could not settle. Inside, Pritchard asked a question she could not fully hear. Lenora answered with one clear sentence. An heir secures inheritance. Sentiment secures nothing. The world did not tilt. It narrowed. Sound from the ballroom thinned to a distant vibration under her ribs, like music heard through walls at the end of a long corridor. She looked down and saw 4 pale crescents rising in her palm where her nails had marked the skin. Footsteps approached from behind. A maid carrying folded shawls slowed when she saw Violet standing still. "Miss Morrison, do you require something?" Violet lowered her hand, turned her wrist so the marks faced inward, and said in a voice that did not waver, "Lady Morrison's fan." The maid shifted the shawls and nudged the door wider with her elbow. Conversation inside stopped at once. Lenora stood near the writing table, Pritchard by the hearth, both composed as portraits. Lenora lifted the ivory fan from the desk and held it out. "You were delayed," she said. Violet took the fan. The corridor was crowded. Pritchard's gaze moved over her face as if evaluating fabric. "Miss Morrison." She met his eyes for one measured second. "Mr. Pritchard." Lenora adjusted one glove. "Return to the ballroom. Lady Ainsworth dislikes waiting." Violet inclined her head. "As you direct." She left them in the library and walked back through the lit corridor with the fan resting cold in her hand, each step exact on the carpet runner, each breath shallow and controlled. At the ballroom threshold she paused only long enough to smooth her expression, then crossed to Lenora's place and set the fan beside the music cards as if nothing in the world had altered at all. She stood at her post until the applause for the violinist swelled and broke. Then she moved through the edge of the crowd with the guest ledger in her hands and set it on the side console where Lenora preferred it. No one stopped her. No one noticed that she did not return to the door. The ballroom had become brighter as night deepened, chandeliers burning full, wax and perfume thick in the air, silk brushing silk in calculated passes. Violet crossed that brightness like a shadow that had learned her route too well to stumble, and when she reached the corridor, she did not look back. Her palm still held the faint crescent impressions from the library door. They had darkened from white to pink. In the east wing, her room was exactly as she had left it. Narrow bed, small desk, one candle burning low. She shut the door, knelt once before the bed frame and pulled her valise into the center of the rug. The lock clicked open with a sound no louder than breath. She packed with the precision of habit and the speed of necessity. 2-day dresses, 1 shawl, grammar books, Elias's letters, coin purse, writing case. She opened the desk drawer and added Mr. Dane's note about remittance, the copy of the voluntary deduction form, the maintenance ledgers she had been required to duplicate for London, and Lenora's letters with their repeated command to keep her voice low. Paper had bound her all summer. Paper could unbind her now. When the valise was full, she wrapped the account copies in plain cloth and tied them with twine, separate from her clothing, as though she were moving evidence rather than belongings. She paused only once, hand on the drawer where a ribbon she had worn in London still lay folded and unused. She left it there. From downstairs came the muffled pulse of music beginning again, a set for dancing she would be expected to witness, but never join. By the time the second waltz began, she had blown out the candle, lifted her valise, and stepped into the corridor. She did not take the servant's stair. She took the central stair beneath the portraits. At the study door, she set down the valise, shifted the wrapped papers to her left arm, and entered without knocking. Lenora stood beside the desk in evening satin, listening while Mr. Hollis read from a guest list. Mr. Dane sat in the chair near the fire with a folio on his knees, as if legal paper had been invited to the musicale as an honoured guest. Pritchard leaned against the mantel, one hand in his pocket, bored and confident. All three turned at once. Lenora's expression hardened by a degree. "You are needed in the ballroom." Violet crossed to the desk, placed the bundle of copied letters and account pages on the blotter, and laid Lenora's most recent correspondence on top. She kept her hands flat on the paper for one brief moment, anchoring herself to the grain of the wood. "No further, Mother," she said. Silence settled so quickly that the clock on the shelf sounded loud as a hammer. Lenora removed one glove finger by finger, then set the glove down. "You are overtired. Return to your duties and we shall discuss this in the morning." Violet lifted her chin. "There will be no morning discussion." Mr. Dane rose halfway, cautious. "Miss Morrison, this is not the proper forum for contractual revision." "It is the forum where the contract was enforced," she said, without looking at him. "You have the copies you required. You also have the letters that establish coercion tied to my brother's apprenticeship, wage deductions leveraged as discipline, and marriage directives issued against my stated refusal. Keep them." Pritchard gave a short laugh, contemptuous and soft. "You overestimate your leverage." Violet turned her head and met his eyes. "I decline your claim." He pushed off the mantle. "You have declined before." "Then hear it clearly again." Lenora's voice cut between them, flat and cold. "You will lower your tone and remain where you are useful." Violet looked back at her mother. Her own voice stayed even. "I am leaving Hallowick tonight. You have no carriage. I have feet." Lenora's mouth tightened. "And where will you go? To whom?" "Women do not walk out of reputable houses after midnight because they have indulged themselves in grievance." Violet lifted the valise from beside the door and set it upright at her side. "Watch me." Mr. Hollis shifted uneasily, eyes moving from Lenora to the open doorway. Mr. Dane gathered his folio as though papers might shield him from consequence. Lenora stepped forward one pace. "If you leave," she said, "Elias's payments stop." Violet felt the blow land, precise and expected. Something in her chest constricted, then steadied. She had spent months bargaining with that threat and feeding it with obedience. It had never grown gentler. "If you stop them," she answered, "you prove every line in those pages true." Lenora stared at her, and in that stare Violet saw calculation changing shape, searching for purchase and finding less than before. What Lenora did not know, what she had not bothered to learn, was how many clerks had touched those copied sheets, how many signatures already sat beneath notations she believed private. Mr. Dane cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morrison, perhaps we should review documents before taking immediate action." Lenora did not look at him. "Miss Morrison, remain." Violet put the strap of the valise over her wrist and moved backward to the threshold. No. One word, 4 letters. The shortest line she had spoken in that house and the first that felt entirely her own. She turned and walked out. No one followed. The corridor air felt cooler against her face. Behind her, a chair scraped in the study, then stopped. Ahead, distant music rose and faded through closed doors. She took the side passage to avoid the ballroom and descended the service stair, crossing from polished oak to worn stone, from chandelier light to lantern haze. In the lower hall, a maid carrying folded napkins flattened herself against the wall to let Violet pass, eyes wide at the valise and the pace. Violet gave her a small nod and kept walking. At the side entrance, Mrs. Hale was locking the outer bolt against drafts. She turned, saw Violet's bag, and said nothing for several seconds. "Miss Morrison." Violet set the account bundle on the bench long enough to pull on gloves. "I am leaving." "At this hour?" "Yes." Mrs. Hale's gaze dropped to the wrapped papers, then to Violet's face. "Do you have shelter?" Violet thought of London and dismissed it. She thought of neighbours who would report her arrival before dawn. She thought finally of a small gatehouse near the south wall, where a man who was not what he seemed had once handed her a dry cloth for rain-spotted ledgers and never asked for thanks. "I do," she said. Mrs. Hale hesitated, then opened the bolt she had just set. Night air entered in a thin, cold stream, carrying damp earth and rose leaves from the lower beds. "Take the gravel path by the chapel," she said quietly. "Less light, fewer questions." Violet lifted the bundle again. "Thank you." "Do not thank me. Walk quickly." She stepped out into the dark. The estate at night was a different country, lawns silvered under thin moon, hedges reduced to shadow, windows afloat in black stone like rows of watchful eyes. Gravel shifted under her boots in soft, regular crunches. When she passed the chapel, the clock struck once, then again, 11:30. She tightened her grip on the valise and kept to the edge of the path where yew shadows covered her skirt. At the south wall, the gatehouse stood with one lamp lit behind drawn curtains. She stopped at the door and realized her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands did not shake. She set down the valise, lifted her knuckles, and knocked once, then again. A latch moved almost immediately. The door opened. Luca Moretti stood there in formal evening black, coat cut to measure, white shirt immaculate, no trace of garden mud, no labourer's cap in sight. Candlelight from the entry fell across his face and rendered every contradiction plain. The disciplined stillness, the educated bearing, the eyes that had never once belonged to a man hired by agency cart. He looked at the valise, the wrapped papers, the mark still faint in her palm where her fingers had pressed, and then at her. "My name is Adrian Vale," he said in unaccented English, calm as if he were confirming the hour. "I have understood every word you spoke this summer." The sentence struck with the force of a bell heard at close range. The courtyard, the shed, the ledger alcove, the broken English in crowded rooms, the precise Italian in doorways, the unsigned crate at dawn, the route corrections, the legal French, the warning to keep accurate ledgers. Every scene rearranged itself at once. Violet did not step back. She did not step forward. She stood in the spill of candlelight with her valise at her feet and the estate's night wind cold at her neck. He held her gaze and added, just as quietly, "I am the Marquis of Halewick, and I will not permit her claim over you." For one suspended moment she heard nothing but the small hiss of the entry candle and her own breathing. Then Adrian moved aside and opened the door wider, not touching her, making space rather than taking it. "Come inside, Violet," he said. "You're safe here." She picked up the valise, gathered the cloth-wrapped documents against her chest, and crossed the threshold while the door closed gently behind her. Inside the gatehouse, warmth met her first. Coal banked low, beeswax, clean linen, a faint trace of cedar oil from polished wood. The room was small compared with the staterooms of Halewick and infinitely more deliberate. Nothing ornamental sat without purpose. A writing table stood ready with sand, sealing wax, and 3 sharpened quills. A tray held tea already poured. Adrian set a lamp higher and did not reach for her papers until he asked, "May I see what you carried out of the study?" Violet untied the cloth bundle herself and spread the contents across the table in careful rows. Lenora's letters in their crested folds, duplicate wage schedules, Mr. Dane's instructions requesting household irregularities, the signed deduction form for the missing silver sets, her notes on remittance delays, carbon copies of weekly reports. He read quickly, grey eyes moving line to line without any of the feigned uncertainty he had worn all summer. When he reached Lenora's letter commanding silence, his jaw tightened once. "She repeated this instruction each week?" he asked. "Yes." He set the letter down with precision. "You did not obey it. I obeyed the parts that fed my brother." For the first time since she crossed the threshold, he smiled fully. It changed him from controlled to unmistakably alive. "That was the part I noticed first." She looked at him then, truly looked, at the man she had met in mud and ledger alcoves and half-lit corridors. Not merely practiced, principled. Every contradiction had belonged to one design. "You chose not to speak English to me," she said. "I chose not to speak it to anyone who treated silence as proof of lesser mind." His voice remained quiet. "I had reason to audit this house without announcement. Lenora Morrison's arrangements with outside lenders touched Halewick land claims. If I arrived as Marquess, the books would have corrected themselves before I opened them. So you came as a groundsman. I came as someone no one would brief, flatter, or fear." He held her gaze. "I did not expect to find you carrying trays to the still room and paying another man's false debt from your own wages." The words landed without embellishment, and because they were plain, they carried greater weight. Violet rested her fingertips on the edge of the table until sensation returned to her hands. What happens now? At first light, trustees meet in the estate study. You will attend. Your documents will be entered into record. He touched the deduction form. "Every shilling taken from you is restored. Every instrument signed against your inheritance is reviewed under seal. Lenora's leverage ends today." An hour before dawn, while the sky was still iron-grey beyond the gatehouse curtains, Adrian sent 2 riders, one to summon trustees, one to the London bank that held the Morrison trust papers. Violet watched him write both orders in the same hand that had corrected orchard figures in her margins. No flourish, no wasted motion. When Halewick's 6 o'clock bell sounded, she walked beside him up the south path toward the house she had left 3 hours earlier with one valise, and no promise. Servants at the side entrance froze when they saw him in formal coat, with his signet ring uncovered. Carter nearly dropped the door latch. Mrs. Hale, keys at her hip, went very still and then bowed first to him, then to Violet, a fraction deeper than protocol required. In the study, the room had been arranged for judgment. Chairs set in a narrow semicircle, ledgers stacked, seals prepared. Lenora stood at the window in travelling grey, though no journey had been announced. Mr. Dane sat with his folio open, face pale from a night without sleep. Mr. Hollis held a ledger against his chest as if it were armour. 2 trustees from the Halewick board, Sir Edmund Clark and Mrs. Agnes Fairburn, had already taken their seats. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "We begin now," he said. "Miss Morrison remains in the room, her standing as principal, not ancillary." Lenora turned from the window. "This is irregular." Mrs. Fairburn answered before Adrian could. "What is irregular, Mrs. Morrison, is a daughter's trust being pledged without her consent." The first hour moved through documents. Violet's copies were compared to originals from Mr. Dane's folio. Dates were checked against bank entries returned by express rider. Endorsements on 2 debt instruments were examined under magnifier and found inconsistent with prior Morrison signatures. Mr. Dane attempted an explanation built from procedural language and careful omissions. I acted on household authority as presented. Sir Edmund's reply was dry as winter paper. You acted without beneficiary verification on restricted capital. That is not authority. That is exposure. When Lenora finally spoke, her tone was the same flat register she had used in drawing rooms for years. I directed temporary leverage for family continuity. My daughter benefits from family continuity. Violet kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not look away. Mrs. Fairburn read from one of Lenora's letters, each word clipped clean. Keep your voice low. Compliance expected. Prospect with Mr. Pritchard remains amenable. You treated your daughter as negotiable collateral. Lenora did not flinch. Sentiment obscures governance. Adrian set one more paper on the table, the deduction form signed in the shed. And this was governance? Hollis swallowed audibly. The loss required immediate balancing, my lord. Did it? Adrian turned a page in the maintenance ledger. Yesterday, the original silver sets were found in the demonstration cabinet under Mr. Pike's lock, logged to the wrong shelf line. Your dismissal order stood anyway. Her wages were seized anyway. Silence spread. Hollis's knuckles whitened around the ledger spine. Adrian continued, The anonymous replacement crate came from my private account because I would not allow a fabricated deficit to remain overnight. The restoration entry should have been issued in writing to Miss Morrison at once. It was not. Hollis lowered his eyes. No, my lord. By the time the chapel clock struck 10, the rulings were written and sealed. Lenora Morrison was removed from active control of Violet's finances and from discretionary authority over any Morrison trust instrument touching Halewick. She was assigned a fixed allowance and directed to take residence in Bath under independent oversight. Mr. Dane was suspended from estate-facing legal work, pending review by his chamber. Mr. Hollis retained his post under probation and mandatory countersign procedures by Mrs. Fairburn for 1 quarter. The deduction taken from Violet's wages was reversed, with additional compensation for unlawful withholding. A certified notice to Mr. Trent, Elias's master, confirmed full payment of apprenticeship fees for the remaining term from Violet's restored account. Lenora signed the acknowledgement last. She held the pen with perfect steadiness, then set it down, and looked at Violet as if searching for one final point of command. You have made your position, Lenora said. Violet met her mother's eyes. I have kept it. No tears, no speech, just the line, and the room understood it. By late afternoon, an express rider returned from London with Mr. Trent's signed receipt and a brief note in the margin. Fees entered in full. Elias remains in good standing. Violet read the line twice before folding it into Elias's last letter and placing both in her reticule. She did not return to the East Wing as a dependent. She went there once to gather what remained. Mrs. Hale was waiting by the small desk with a narrow blue ribbon laid across her palm. You left this, the housekeeper said. Violet looked at the ribbon she had abandoned in the drawer, and then at the woman who had opened the side door into the night. I thought it would not matter. Mrs. Hale placed it gently atop the valise. It may matter now. In the first week of August, the library windows stood open to a warm wind, carrying cut grass and distant rose. Violet sat at the long table where she had once been sent only to fetch an ivory fan, and the same room now held tenant petitions, shipping corrections, and 2 ledgers she reviewed under her own signature. Adrian stood opposite with estate maps unrolled between them, coat set aside, shirt sleeves precise at the cuff. A footman entered with a visiting card and paused, uncertain where to direct his question. Lady Ainsworth requests guidance on the parish allotment appeal. Shall I place it before his lordship or Miss Morrison? Violet took the card. Before both. The footman bowed and withdrew. Adrian watched the door close, then looked back at her with that measured stillness she had learned to trust. There is one matter no trustee can rule for us. She set down her pen. He came around the table, not hurried, and stopped at a distance that left her room to step away if she wished. I concealed my name. I tested a house and everyone in it. You owe me no kindness for that. His voice lowered. But if you choose freely, without contract, without pressure, I am asking now. Outside, a gardener called for twine. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock marked the quarter hour. The world continued in ordinary sounds while the centre of it shifted. Will you choose me, Violet? He asked. No title, no performance. She rose. Her hand went to the stack of petitions, then rested there, steady. This room had heard her bartered. It heard her answer too. I already did. He exhaled once, a breath he had apparently held for weeks, and the rare smile returned, transforming his face from guarded to bright, with relief she felt in her own chest. He did not claim her hand. He offered his. She placed hers in it. Together they moved back to the table, to maps and petitions and the practical shape of a shared life. Evening light lengthened over the library floor, touching sealed rulings, restored accounts, and Violet Morrison's name written where authority had once excluded her, clear and permanent in her own hand.